the wider Middle East over Israel's ongoing war on Hamas and the Gaza Strip. When improved ballistic missile technology could lead to nuclear weapons, but now Iran is also producing the uranium close to weapons-grade levels. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency warning that Tehran has
gives them money
for several nuclear weapons if they choose to produce them.
Holland was a nation that suffered particularly through the war, with a long and harsh enemy occupation. The underground resistance movement was strong, although the consequences were fatal for anyone caught. Audrey herself witnessed the execution of young men by the Nazis, including her uncle and a cousin of her mother's.
How does the Beijing think that affects their strategy with regard to Taiwan?
A strategic friend of the U.S., Taiwan just elected its new president, William Lai. He's known as a China hawk. Meanwhile, former President Trump is planning to win more votes with his own tough-on-China stance. Rory Daniels, managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis, described the Trump-Lai combination as Beijing's nightmare scenario. Now, Trump is preparing to win the Republican nomination in another state, New Hampshire. He's currently leading in the polls there. Looking forward to U.S.-China ties if he gets elected again. Trump said he wouldn't allow China to take advantage of America. During a rally in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on Wednesday, he vowed to return the country to better days.
One of the most important issues of this race is which candidate can rescue the American economy and save the American dream.
The New Hampshire primary is set for January 23rd, next Tuesday. There are no more debates scheduled before the vote. Real Clear polling averages show former President Trump with a 13-point cushion.
Will be enough to come. As the war approaches its 2-year milestone, Ukraine's largest cities continue to come under heavy fire. Officials say an attack on Tuesday killed at least 4 people and hurt 100, and an attack on Friday was the largest signal assault since the war started, with at least 41 civilians killed. To Paris now, where police officers have gone on strike over plans, or lack thereof, for the Summer Olympic Games. Police unions say officials and organizers have given little clarity about what is expected during this high-security event, and they're even threatening to pull their officers from the Games if nothing is done soon. Newsnet international correspondent Ryan Thompson is there and filed this report.
The countdown is on until millions of visitors descend on Paris for the Olympic Games. But as with any event of this scale, security is top of mind.
Près de 35 000 forces de sécurité intérieure qui seront là ce jour J.
The French Interior Minister announcing that an unprecedented number of officers will be patrolling the French capital, including some 35,000 along the Seine River during the opening ceremony.
Les Jeux Olympiques, ce sera...
But police unions are pushing back on the government's plans, saying they've been left in the dark and now threatening that the games could go on without them.
Ahead of the 6th Olympics come on the 26th of January, police have mobilized across the country at protests just like this one, trying to send a message to the government that they want a clear plan about where they're going to be and how much they're going to be paid.
It's been a long time that we've been asking for information about how the government is going to help us when we...
In what were these elections that would determine the United States. Essentially, at the heart of the argument is that the Stacey Abrams-founded organization was making the claim that by questioning the validity of the voter rolls, True the Vote was actually in violation of the Voting Rights Act. And just for your reference, the specific part of that law that they claim was being violated was Section 11, subsection 2, which reads this, quote, "No person, whether acting under color of law or otherwise, shall intimidate, threaten, or coerce, or attempt to intimidate, threaten, or coerce any person for voting or attempting to vote." And so you see, on the one hand, the argument was that these social media posts, articles, and podcast appearances by True the Vote urging people to challenge the voter rolls constituted a form of voter suppression. On the other hand, though, True the Vote's legal team was making the counter-argument that their actions, including their search for illegal votes, was fully protected under the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And so these were the two competing arguments in the case, which plodded along in the legal system for about 3 years before finally getting to trial. Now, eventually, the case did make it to trial, and after hearing both sides and considering the merits of the case, the judge ruled in favor of True the Vote. Specifically, in a fairly thick 145-page ruling, Judge Stephen Jones, who was appointed to the bench by Barack Obama, he ruled that this effort to challenge the eligibility of hundreds of thousands of Georgia voters did not violate the Voting Rights Act. Here's part of what he wrote. Quote, having heard the evidence presented and the arguments made by the parties, the court maintains its prior concerns about the manner in which True the Vote utilized Georgia law to challenge individual voters. The court, however, ultimately concludes that, as a legal matter, the plaintiffs have not carried their burden to show a violation of Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act. The court entered judgment in favor of True the Vote. There is no evidence that True the Vote attempted to make any of the voters in this case feel timid or fearful, or that they experienced any actual reasonable intimidation. Essentially, what the judge determined here was that, for one, when True the Vote was using these social media posts, these articles, and these podcasts to urge people to challenge the voter rolls, they were not trying to intimidate the voters themselves, since it's even dubious whether those voters themselves would have even known about the existence of these articles and these podcasts. And then secondly, the judge found that these calls to action were protected speech under the First Amendment. Now, as you would imagine, the defendants in the case were thrilled with the ruling, with Ms. Catherine Engelbrecht, who is the founder of True the Vote, releasing this video as a response. And just for your reference, I'm going to speed up the video just a little bit so we can get through it faster.
Not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
The many misdeeds and tragedies of this family has only enhanced the world's affection towards them.
I've been doing. As an order to the nation, the president of the United States, by wing of the president action. They make this, and there's the president do for this now action. Now, the legal attacks and other to derail Trump, they're starting to look really bad for Biden, though. This is the other big side of it. Here's Biden campaign co-chair, this is Jeffrey Katzenberg, responding to a question about keeping Trump off of the ballot, because that's what they're trying to do. Let me show you.
You said that voters will decide the election. Does the campaign feel undemocratic for a presidential candidate to be sent off the ballot?
I don't know. Yeah.
You getting that? Is it undemocratic to make it so that people in this country cannot vote for the candidate they want? Is it democratic to destroy the system of democracy? Answer, I don't know.
Prospect of using Japanese shipyards to overhaul U.S. Navy warships, and how effective it would be. U.S. Ambassador to Japan Rahm Emanuel announced that plan at the U.S. Naval Base in Japan. He said repairing ships in Japan rather than in the U.S. would boost military deterrence in the region by keeping military assets in place.
If we ever have a hot situation, which I hope never happens as a father of a Navy officer and as an American, you don't want to start training and working together in that type of tense situation. You want to do it beforehand. That's why we train together, so therefore that's why we should repair and maintain together. And keeping ships in theater is part of our deterrence.
The ambassador said the plan could allow the U.S. to have better military deterrence against communist China. He noted that Beijing watches which ships enter and exit the region and evaluates U.S. deterrence accordingly. Japan hosts the biggest overseas concentration of U.S. military power, including the only forward-deployed carrier strike group. Most of the U.S. 7th Fleet is based in Japan. It commands up to 70 ships and submarines. The Philippines bolstering security ties with Canada amid Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. The two countries signed defense cooperation agreement on Friday. A move the Philippines' top defense official said could later lead to a troop pact between the two countries. The plan for possible military visits is called a Visiting Forces Agreement, the same deal the Philippines has with the U.S. It allows the rotation of thousands of American troops in and out of the Philippines for war drills and exercises. Coming up, more information on the COVID-19 pandemic timeline unveiled by Dr. Anthony Fauci in a 14-hour testimony. Lawmakers called some of what he said eye-opening. Response still linger. For instance, did the virus leak from a lab in Wuhan? And were the nationwide lockdowns, social distancing requirements, and mask mandates actually based on science? Last week, Dr. Anthony Fauci gave a 14-hour testimony to the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic behind closed doors. According to lawmakers, some of his comments were revealing. According to a statement from the subcommittee, Fauci said the social distancing guidance from federal health officials likely had no scientific basis, and that the policy, quote, sort of just appeared. On the topic of the COVID vaccine, Fauci reportedly admitted the vaccine mandates could prompt more vaccine hesitancy in the future. According to the subcommittee statement, he also acknowledged that the lab leak hypothesis was not a conspiracy theory. Congressman Brad Wenstrup, chairman of the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic, said Fauci said he didn't recall important information related to COVID-19 over 100 times, including conversations he had about its origins. More information about the timeline of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lawmakers have been releasing documents showing that the genetic sequence of the CCP virus was submitted to an NIH database 2 weeks before the Chinese regime officially disclosed it. To find out more about the Chinese regime's role in the early stages of the pandemic, NTV's Steve Lance sat down with Senator Roger.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Always glad to share our story a little bit.
Absolutely, Senator. How do you think that the CCP's handling of COVID-19, specifically the information that they had before anybody else knew it, has impacted global security, both in the health field and beyond?
Yeah. You know, it's a long story to try to condense it all in just a matter of a couple of seconds. But let me just start by saying that there is a huge body of evidence out there that if I could get in front of the jury, that they would find the Chinese Communist Party, guilty of leaking this virus from a laboratory out of Wuhan, China. A huge body of evidence out there. And I think we're, even this last couple of weeks, new evidence coming forth that Dr. Ren, who worked for the Chinese Communist Party as a pathologist, actually sent to our own NIH lab bank the COVID DNA sequence 2 weeks before we had someone else who was brave enough to do that. But the NIH was stupid enough to delete it. So we could have started on that vaccination process 2 weeks earlier at a minimum. But the fact that they hid what was going on there, that they continued to say over and over again that this was not transmitted person to person, it kept us from responding in the fashion we could have. That we actually taught them how to do this. By the way, even Dr. Ren was working for EcoHealth, funded through the NIH. So when they're continuing this type of research, it definitely affects our national security. Even again, last week we found out that they're working on a COVID virus that impacts the brain rather than the lungs. So I just don't see the benefit in doing that. So they're probably using American dollars to do research, continue this viral gain of function research. That's why we've asked for a moratorium on any type of research like this.
To your point, even former NIH Director Francis Collins, Dr. Fauci, as recently as this week, saying that the idea of COVID being leaked from a lab is not a conspiracy theory anymore.
Right. You know, it's just amazing me. Here we are. Goodness, it's 2024. It's 4 years after this happened. And the things that I was being censored for, being taken offline as a physician myself, for being criticized because I didn't agree with Dr. Fauci. Now Dr. Fauci really putting some cards on the table, Dr. Collins as well, saying, no, well, maybe it did come from the laboratory. Certainly all the evidence, this huge body of evidence says it came from a laboratory. They still haven't found an animal source from it. Here we are again, 4 years later, no animal source. It was a perfect virus. And by the way, the Chinese Communist Party has killed all the witnesses. So many of the witnesses that wanted to share information have just mysteriously died. Even the person that was doing the vaccine research and probably where it was leaked from, that person has died as well. They've taken down all the DNA sequences from our laboratory banks as well as their own laboratory banks. They could easily disprove our theory if they would just go into their own lab bank and show us the cousin or the brother of this virus, but they're not willing to do that.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky did not have
occurring in that state, where, I mean, the most virulent form of discrimination was something along the lines of restrictive covenants in individual housing. Another thing I'll say about the California plan, it seems like the numbers in it were almost just picked out of thin air by hopeful bureaucrats. I mean, the figures chosen are in the billions. If you look at the wealth gap in the USA between black households and white households, which is the only reasonable starting point for reparations, if you want to have an adult grown man and woman conversation about this, that's $100,000 at most, and it's less than that in California. So, I mean, you'd have to figure out what percentage of that is plausibly due to past racism once you adjust for age, residence, test scores, so on. The California plan proposed, I believe the starting point was $5 million for every black adult in the state, which didn't have a long tradition of really oppressing black people. So it didn't make sense to me. It seemed like another one of those virtue signaling gestures we saw after the unfortunate death of George Floyd. I mean, that would be my frank take on that.
Horace, what are your thoughts, on the compensation plans?
Well, let me just add, and I agree with that completely, Will. Let me just add, this proposal is a doorstop holder. It will not go anywhere. I want to reiterate, this plan is completely and totally untethered to any traditional sense of any and restitution.